All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CSIS, and welcome to the fifth and final debate on the INF Treaty and the future of arms control. This is the fifth debate that's been sponsored by the CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues and as well as by Ploughshares, which has partnered with us on this effort. So indeed, if you were here for the debate, you are in the right meeting. We have a lot of meetings going on in this building. And if for some reason you think you were supposed to be doing something else with the regional office, now is your moment to make your escape. My name is Rebecca Hirschman. I am the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS and a senior advisor in the International Security Program, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. As many know, we always have a security announcement here, and so I will make the requisite announcement. We always try to share our building safety precautions, and overall we feel very secure in this building, but as a convener we do have a duty to make sure that we're prepared for any eventuality. So we have a very robust safety system in the building. I am your responsible safety officer. I'm assisted by my staff, presently located both in the front and the back of the room. If for any reason we receive instructions that we need to relocate from this area, we will either follow and down the stairs and straight out the front door to the designated location, or we have alternative exits out the back. So please just be familiar, be aware of your environment, but otherwise I'm quite sure we will have a very successful next hour and a half. We really are excited to be here. Very much appreciate the chance we've been able to partner with Ploughshares on this effort and engage this series of debates on nuclear challenges and policy decisions that would be facing the Trump administration in 2017. The debate series has aimed to provide a forum for in-depth exploration of the arguments of both sides and even the middle of any number of nuclear policy issues, and we have some excellent ones for today. Today marks the fifth and final debate in the series. We've been really excited about how this has gone, the participation both in the room and online. We want to thank all of you for participating, thank Ploughshares for your partnership. I will take a moment to remind you that the meeting is on the record and will be available on the CSIS website for viewing afterwards, and it is also being live streamed. We are live tweeting the event from our CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues account and using the hashtag CSIS Live. So with that, I'll start with a little bit of background, make some introductions, and then we will get into the heart of the matter. So the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, is today at a historical juncture, the resolution of which will have a substantial impact not only on the future of the treaty itself, but also upon the future course of arms control between the United States and Russia. Negotiations on what would become the INF Treaty began in the late 1970s following the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 Sabre in 1977. A mobile IRBM whose range came in just below the SALT II minimum range for an ICBM. Signed in 1987 and following the 1986 Reykjavik summit between President Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, the treaty eliminated U.S. and Soviet ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, their launchers and associated support structures and support equipment. And this successfully contributed to the elimination of nearly 2,700 missiles by 1991. U.S. concerns about Russian compliance with the treaty have been steadily mounting for years. The United States complained in 2012 that two Russian systems violated the treaty. The R-500, a cruise missile that utilizes the 9K-720 Iskander launcher, and a short-range ICBM. American officials formally notified Russia of a breach for developing and possessing prohibited weapons in July of 2014, and the U.S. Raised again concerns of Russia of an even greater breach of the treaty earlier this year with the deployment of the Russian SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missile. The Russians have countered calling the treaty unfair, as rivals in Asia, namely China, are not bound by the INF treaty and are free to pursue intermediate-range missiles, and they've accused the United States of violating the treaty with its unmanned drone programs and the planned deployment of Aegis Ashore in Europe and a number of other criticisms. The House and Senate have also tackled the treaty in the FY 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. Through several of the issues included in the bill on either side must be worked out in reconciliation. As of now, both bills require the Secretary of Defense to produce a report on modifying an existing missile system or developing a new system to fill in the INF ranges and provide certain types of appropriations, which differ somewhat with considering research and development in those areas. So there's a lot of concern and much to be resolved here. So there's several core questions that are on the table today. For example, while there's little agreement, and there's, I think the first question really is, are there any realistic prospects for restoring confidence and compliance with the INF treaty through diplomacy, transparency, or negotiation? Should the United States continue to respect and abide by its INF treaty obligations or consider withdrawal if Russia does not return to compliance? Can the United States consider future arms control agreements with Russia so long as this matter remains unresolved? Both the United States and Russia are required to achieve the central limits of the New START treaty early this next year. Unless it's extended, the treaty will then expire in 2021. How should the INF treaty dispute shape U.S. policy towards the New START treaty? Should the United States consider even a simple extension, 5-year extension of New START as permitted by the treaty, as long as Russia continues to possess non-INF compliant delivery systems? What about our force posture? Should the United States consider the reintroduction of ground-based intermediate-range missiles? Should we consider the research and development of such capabilities without necessarily developing them or fielding them, as called for by some provisions in the House and Senate NDAA? Should we consider deploying other intermediate-range nuclear capabilities, such as a sea-launched cruise missile? For example, a sort of redeveloped, revamped TLAM-N. Or are there other options, such as enhanced presence, enhanced forward deployed, dual-capable aircraft, to send some sort of message along these lines, but in a way that would be compliant with the INF treaty? So as you can see, the future of the INF treaty, as well as the New START treaty, are quite complicated. Fortunately, we have an exceptional panel of experts here to debate these questions. And before I introduce them, I'll give a few ground rules and restate the resolution. So, the resolution they've been asked to consider is as follows. The United States should respond to Russia's INF violations by developing and deploying additional nuclear capabilities and refusing to negotiate any further arms control agreements until Russia complies with the treaty. So this is what's on the table. So, who do we have here to discuss? Well, to my left, and speaking in favor of developing and deploying additional nuclear capabilities and refusing future negotiations, we have Franklin C. Miller, who's a principal at the Scowcroft Group. Frank Miller was Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and a Senior Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council. He spent 31 years in government, including 22 years in the Department of Defense under 7 different secretaries. He currently serves on the Defense Science Board and the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group, as well as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a director of the Atlantic Council of the United States. Farther to our left, we have Rebecca Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute. She is, it was an unintended humor. Rebecca is a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute, where she specializes in nuclear deterrence, missile defense, and counterproliferation. Rebecca has served as an advisor on military and foreign policy issues to Representative Trent Franks, and is a member who is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and she helped launch the Bipartisan Missile Defense Caucus. She's testified before Congress, presented in numerous organizations, is on TV quite frequently. I'm sure you've probably seen her. Now, speaking against the resolution, we have, to my far right, Alexandra Bell, who is a Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Alex was Director for Strategic Outreach in the Office of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the Department of State. She was previously at the Ploughshares Fund and the Center for American Progress. She is also a Truman National Security Fellow, a Council on Foreign Relations term member, a 2017 Munich Security Conference Young Leader, a member of the Project on Nuclear Issues Mid-Career Cadre, and a host of other, I'm not going to keep listing them. Then to my immediate right, Tom Countryman, the former Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Tom was a career diplomat who served as the Acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security and the Assistant Secretary for International Security and Nonproliferation. He served in embassies throughout a long career in Belgrade, Cairo, Athens, and Rome. He was an advisor for Ambassador Albright on Middle East issues at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. He is fluent in Serbo-Croatian, Arabic, Italian, Greek, and German.
Not fluent, but close in English.
So as you can see, we have an exceptional panel today, and I actually will say that it feels very PONI-like to sit in the middle and to have flipped the sides. So I think that says something about our goals of bipartisan and respectful debate, so we're excited to be here. A couple of mechanics, just so you know how this is going to work. Each debater will have 5 minutes for their opening statement for a total of 10 minutes per side. Following opening statements, I will have the opportunity to ask some questions of each of the presenters, and they'll have about 2 minutes for response. After the conclusion of the moderator questions, each side will have 5 minutes total for a rebuttal, and then we will open the floor to you. I'll ask that you state your name, your affiliation, keep it to a question, not a comment, and we'll do our level best to try to make sure they go reasonably equally both ways. Throughout the debate, if you see a little sign being raised in the front, you'll know that they're looking at green signs that say you can start talking now, a yellow sign that says 1 minute to finish, and red, you're done. So they're under some time pressure up here to come to a rapid conclusion. Following, though, we will ask you to join us at a reception outside where you'll have a chance to talk amongst yourselves, but also with everyone assembled up here. Tell us what we did right, what we got wrong, how we could do better, and just enjoy the conversation. So with that, we will begin, and I understand that it is the Miller-Heinrichs team.
And for accuracy, I've been associated with the Defense Policy Board. No one who knows me would associate me with the Defense Science Board. I'm going to begin with a few fundamental propositions. The first is that arms control is not a policy goal in and of itself. Arms control treaties are mechanisms. They enhance strategic stability, constrain adversary military capabilities, manage military competition, and increase transparency, which are, in fact, policy goals. Second, international agreements are designed and intended to be honored. When one party continually violates the treaties it has signed without penalty, it establishes a pattern that undercuts the value of treaties and discredits the entire practice. Indeed, when one party violates treaties while the other party complies, the national security of the second party is endangered. The Russian Federation, in the last 10 years under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has demonstrated conclusively that it is a serial violator of arms-controlled treaties. Today, Russia stands in violation of the Istanbul Accords, which Moscow signed in 1999. Russian forces nevertheless remain not only in parts of Georgia and Moldova, but they're supporting separatist elements seeking to break away from the central governments. The Budapest Agreement, also signed in 1999, guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We all know how that worked out. The Helsinki Accords, Articles 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, which commit the signatories to respect international boundaries in Europe, not meddle in the internal affairs of other countries, and to forego the use of force to change those boundaries. Ask leaders in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania how that's going. The Open Skies Treaty, which requires that they provide U.S. and allied aircraft unfettered access to their entire airspace for aerial photography. Moscow is violating this treaty by illegally constraining flights over Kaliningrad, along its border with Georgia, and over Moscow itself. In addition, there are other arms control commitments that Russia has made, which Moscow either evades or ignores. Russia has been and continues to be in violation of the 1991-1992 presidential nuclear initiatives signed by President George H.W. Bush and by Gorbachev and reaffirmed by President Bush and Boris Yeltsin. These initiatives are political, but they've never been rescinded. The United States has complied strictly with the PNIs, destroying the vast majority of its shorter-range nuclear weapon systems. Russia, however, not only maintains and modernizes its bloated arsenal of thousands of such weapons, but violates those commitments by deploying nuclear-tipped cruise missiles aboard submarines and by retaining and upgrading short-range, ground-launched nuclear-capable ballistic and cruise missiles. Russia routinely violates the 2011 Vienna Convention by obscuring and providing false information about the size and scope of its military exercises. The CTBT Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty forbids nuclear testing, but does not precisely define what a nuclear test is. The United States, which has not ratified the treaty, nevertheless has conducted no nuclear tests. Russia, taking advantage of the treaty's failure to define zero yield, apparently continues to carry out weapons tests at extremely low yields. Finally, Russia, for decades under Soviet leadership and later under Russian leadership, has maintained an extensive biological weapons program in violation of the BWC, while stoutly denying the existence of such a program, and there's still doubt today whether the program was ever dismantled. So we come to the INF Treaty, one of two foundational treaties of the Cold War era. Russia has covertly developed, tested, and deployed a new intermediate-range nuclear-capable ground-launched cruise missile, a clear and unambiguous violation of the treaty. A decision to proceed with a program of such international significance is not the result of a rogue technical design bureau or military unit. It derives from a decision made at the highest levels of the Russian government, a decision which demonstrates contempt for both the arms control process, for international treaties and obligations, and for the United States and NATO's anticipated lack of response to this action. If the United States were to negotiate an extension to New START with these violations unresolved, it would signal that it is unconcerned not only about the INF violation, but all the other treaty violations as well, and that it does not intend to hold Russia to carrying out its commitments, and that it acquiesces in the farce of signing, and worse yet, abiding by agreements that it does not believe its negotiating partner will adhere to. If we believe the INF Treaty is meaningful, we should be working to push Moscow to return to compliance. The only way to do so is to present Moscow with unacceptable alternatives to the treaty's demise, that is, U.S. counter-deployments of a system or systems which provide a highly credible threat to Putin and his regime. This approach, incidentally, was what brought the USSR back to the INF Treaty table in the mid-1980s and eventually led to the treaty. For the time being, the United States should remain within the treaty while continuing to call out Russia for its violations. At the same time, the administration should begin research and development on new INF systems in a treaty-compliant manner, as well as explore other opportunities to present the Kremlin with extremely unattractive alternatives to their continued violations. All of these actions are allowable under international law, and no decisions need to be made now as to where and how such potential U.S. systems should be deployed. Those decisions may be necessary if Russian bad behavior is not corrected. Should it come to that, however, the U.S. must make clear to the world in a fully transparent manner that we are not pulling out of the treaty, rather that it is Russia's flagrant actions which have destroyed the treaty, rendering it null and void.
Rebecca.
I'll go ahead and take the second part of the statement first, because it's so reasonable, it borders along self-evident in my view. And that is that the United States should refuse to negotiate any further arms control agreements until Russia complies with the INF Treaty. Take that one first. This is something that I support for the following reasons. One, if Russia wants further arms control treaties to limit U.S. arms, this would be great leverage to get the Russian Federation to go back into compliance with the INF Treaty. You'll notice I will overlap a little bit with Frank and just understand that that's just a point of emphasis then. And so therefore, this should be a necessary condition for any new treaty or an extension of current treaties. Two, failure to do so communicates that while we recognize the Russians have proven themselves willing to enter into treaties to exploit U.S. compliance for their own strategic gain, and that we will tolerate more of the same while simultaneously weakening our own deterrent. Or, in the words of President Barack Obama, rules must be binding, violations must be punished, words must mean something. 3, refusing to enter negotiations with the Russians until they are complying with the INF Treaty bolsters the credibility of the treaties in which the United States is party to generally, and the United States will enforce them, thereby strengthening the effectiveness of treaties per se. This is good for nonproliferation purposes at large, something my colleagues disagreeing with the resolution profess to take quite seriously. And perhaps mostly in the interest of my friends more passionate about arms control treaties in and of themselves, if we are to build political consensus in the U.S. Senate to move forward with more treaties, we must demonstrate that these are not exercises in futility or worse, exercises in merely submitting to what the Russians want. Or in the words of, this is reported that Senator Kerry said upon finding out that the Russians were in violation of the INF Treaty, he said, "We're not going to pass another treaty if the U.S. Senate, in the U.S. Senate, if our colleagues are sitting up here knowing that somebody is cheating," end quote. And then taking the first part of the resolution now, that the United States should respond to Russia's INF violations by developing and deploying additional nuclear capabilities. As former Supreme Allied Commander General Breedlove urged, this INF violation must be answered. And I would add, failure to do so only encourages further violations of INF and also may tempt Russia to increase its provocations if they will not be met with a response. The purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter large-scale war. We must start from this purpose and work from it. So the question is, does developing and deploying additional nuclear capabilities in response to Russian INF treaty violations help to strengthen the U.S. hand in deterring war? The evidence supports that it is. As my colleague Frank has ably laid out, Russia's behavior and serial violations of arms control treaties, and it demonstrates that its nuclear posture. It's relying more on nuclear weapons as the United States decreases our reliance on nuclear weapons per the Obama administration. And how the Russians have set their sights on the NATO alliance as an enemy. So I'm not going to go back through that. But with that as the context, the United States and NATO must ensure its offensive nuclear force is flexible enough and provides the options needed to effectively match or outmatch that of any potential adversary in order to convince adversaries that their aggression against the United States and its interests, and in particular their use of nuclear weapons, however small that nuclear weapon would be, would not be worth the cost. The Russians' willingness to even brandish this escalate to de-escalate strategy requires the United States and NATO to have on the ready tactical nuclear weapons as an answer to this threat. So it is a straw man to say that developing additional capabilities would fracture the alliance and therefore it would be imprudent to work to bolster NATO's strategic deterrent, as if NATO's squeamishness about nuclear weapons is not something U.S. leadership cannot help to overcome. In fact, I would agree that NATO should support the additional developments or deployments of U.S. Nuclear weapons in the European theater, and U.S. leadership should work to gain political and public support among NATO allies, and that will certainly require public discussion of Russia's exercises, threats, and evidence of Russia's violations of the INF Treaty, and I'll close there.
First, I'd like to thank CSIS and Ploughshares for hosting this debate and working to broaden the discussion on nuclear policy issues. It's very important for all of us to be discussing these critical security issues. Second, I'd like to say that we actually agree with Frank and Rebecca. The Russian INF violation and the development and apparent small-scale deployment of the SSC-8 is a big deal and a big problem. We agree that it's a bad idea to simply trust Putin, whether about nuclear security agreements, oh, me?
Yes.
Her. Again, we agree that it's a bad idea to simply trust Putin, whether it's international security agreements or real estate deals. We agree that Russia's overall behavior towards its neighbors and the world is reckless and short-sighted. We also agree that with Frank and Rebecca in that we need a response to Russia's INF violation, and part of that response should involve military countermeasures. Here's where we differ. The United States should only break its word when there is no other possible alternative. We have a choice. We do not have to violate the INF Treaty or any of our other arms control obligations in order to respond to this Russian violation. Yes, we need a military response, one designed by qualified military planners and their State Department counterparts in concert with allies. This response should not be a bluff or a bargaining chip, and it should not push us into a position of playing Russia's game. Our deterrent capabilities include existing nuclear weapons, but also conventional, diplomatic, and economic tools. We have a wealth of existing capabilities that we can deploy to counter this violation, as well as multiple ways to respond with conventional countermeasures. The process has already begun with the European Reassurance Initiative. In addition to expanding this capability, the United States should continue to hold joint exercises with allies to improve interoperability and coordination. With regard to specific systems, we can deploy more conventional bombers at bases in NATO countries. We can make joint air-to-surface missiles available to more allies. Additionally, we could sell allies the extended-range variant, the JASSM-ER. We can deploy surface ships and subs with conventional cruise missiles in the North Sea. The Russians are also well aware of our ability to deploy subs with nuclear capabilities nearby. Finally, many in Congress and the administration have already endorsed the idea of a long-range standoff weapon to replace our existing air-launched cruise missiles. Certainly, that would be a long-term aid in response to the Russian violation, one that would not violate INF. It would also negate the purpose of the new intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile, like the one being proposed in the 2018 Defense Authorization Bill. In fact, all of the options mentioned can help provide pressure as we pursue diplomatic options to bring Russia back into compliance without violating INF or other agreements ourselves. They also have the benefit of being cheaper and more flexible. Of course, any of these options need to be thoroughly discussed and coordinated with our NATO allies. Ladies and gentlemen, INF is worth saving, and we still have time to do it. And that's according to our senior military leaders. In July 2017, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Paul Selva, stated, "Given the location of the specific missile and deployment, Russia has not gained any advantage in Europe. As of yet, that assessment has not changed. The fact of the matter is that responding to the INF violation by developing and deploying new nuclear capabilities would be militarily unnecessary, ineffective, and expensive. Further, as my esteemed colleague will demonstrate, refusing to negotiate new nuclear arms agreements until INF is fixed could serve to undermine an entire system of treaties and agreements that have helped us avert a nuclear nightmare for the last 50 years. And with that, I yield to him.
Thank you. At a time when the U.S. Senate has given up the practice of debating before voting, I'm glad we can still debate here. There is a strange confluence of reflexes here, if you like, a double knee-jerk. On the one hand, a return to the instinct of many U.S. thinkers in the Cold War, early in the Cold War, to imitate every stupid thing that the Russians did, whether it built our security or stability or not. And secondly, there is the reflex of President Trump to do the opposite of whatever President Obama did, whether that makes sense or not. And it is, of course, matched by the similar desire of President Putin to undo everything that Gorbachev did. In this case, of course, it undoes one of the signal achievements of the venerated President Ronald Reagan. Now, Rebecca and Frank have not presented arguments that are reflexive. They've presented careful, rational arguments, many points of which I agree with. But it is still important to realize that we are not in a normal period where we have a president that the world trusts to keep U.S. commitments. I understand the desire for unrestricted freedom of action that motivated American generals early in the Cold War and that motivated Soviet and Russian generals today. Unrestricted freedom of action, the ability to have a designer nuke for every occasion, is tempting. But there has been a far greater and more important goal served by looking for strategic stability. And this is what has been served by arms control agreements between Washington and Moscow through decades, under 7 presidents, through the hardest times that included the U-2 incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the invasion of Afghanistan, and other Russian treaty violations. And this is what concerns me about the second part of the resolution. Not just that we're breaking a pattern that has served U.S. national security interests well, but all the other effects that this will have. First of all, recognize that the threat that we think we're making to Moscow with this idea is utterly feckless. In other words, they would have Washington say to Moscow, if you don't do what we want you to do, then we will do what you want us to do. If you don't come back into violation, we will create a situation in which we join in violating the treaty. We do it overtly instead of covertly. And in that case, we suffer the opprobrium of the world and are blamed for the demise of the treaty, while Russia reaps both the military and political benefits of being unconstrained by the INF treaty. Secondly, arms control agreements have always served U.S. national security goals, and I absolutely agree with Mr. Miller when he said they are not an end in themselves. They do serve to provide an unparalleled window into Moscow's arsenal. They provide insight, monitoring, and verification capabilities that cannot be matched only by national technical means. Third, the signal of saying we won't negotiate any more arms control, if not initiating an arms race, will invite an arms race. Instead of seeking steps that simply match what Moscow is doing, we should be seeking steps that will reinforce the stability that Moscow is undermining. Fourth, saying that we are no longer interested in arms control negotiations with the other power in the world, remember the two of us together have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, is a step that undermines the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an agreement in which the U.S., with ratification by the Senate, committed to work for reduction in numbers and towards the elimination, towards comprehensive disarmament. And in undermining that treaty, we are increasing the incentive for other countries to follow the North Korean example and develop their own nukes. We are taking away the U.S. leadership that has done so much to constrain proliferation and to ensure that we don't have literally dozens of countries around the world that possess nuclear weapons. And finally, saying we are not interested in negotiating agreements, arms control agreements, undermines the credibility of U.S. commitments and of U.S. negotiating strength in every context, not just in arms control, but in counterterrorism and in trade agreements as well. I understand the point, and I agree that in order to pass ratification by the Senate, there has to be credibility of enforcement. But the way to do that is not to simply refuse to negotiate. It is to emphasize to any partner that we have a significant hurdle in the Senate. Building a new U.S. weapon, a new U.S. nuclear weapon, is not a coherent military response. We have enough political nuclear weapons. What I want to do is trust the overwhelming conventional superiority that the U.S. has and rely on that to counter this threatening Russian maneuver.
Thank you very much. Excellent statements. Have put a lot of information on the table, but it's now my turn to push a little bit on both of you. To get that started, in fact, I want to pick up on something that came up at the end of Tom's remarks to you all. Why wouldn't it be distinctly in the United States to our benefit to kind of take the high ground, to continue complying with the treaty, especially if we could augment our posture or apply pressure through other means, through additional conventional activities, or even nuclear-related capabilities that are fully compliant with the current treaty? Which one of you would like to tackle first?
First of all, the treaty, in essence, doesn't exist for the Russians. They are deploying new INF systems. If you want to reverse that, if you believe in the INF treaty, we have tried all of these other mechanisms, unless you want to start putting economic sanctions on the Russians for this too. you have to go back to the basic principles. Why did they sign the INF Treaty in the first place? The SS-20 deployments of which you spoke rose meteorically until the United States deployed Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles, and the Russian military decided they were in trouble and needed to cap those deployments. If you want negotiating leverage on Moscow, you must go ahead with something that now gets their attention. Otherwise, it's a unilateral disarmament measure on our part because we're letting Russia violate the treaty and doing nothing ourselves. What Rebecca and I have been talking about is doing R&D within the constraints of the treaty, and then deciding, in a couple of years, whether or not the Russians are, in fact, hopelessly going to stay out of the treaty and keep deploying their systems, or whether there's a chance for negotiations. If there is no chance for negotiations, we can then decide how and where and why we will deploy new nuclear weapons.
Rebecca, do you have a quick add? Or are you?
And I would just add to that, there's a spectrum of options that we have before us that do not include violating the INF Treaty. And so I think that we should exercise those options. You mentioned a couple of in your opening statement. The Tomahawk missile, the TLAMN and Tomahawk missile, which is a sea-launched missile, would not be in violation of the INF Treaty. Also supportive of the LRSO, the new stealthy air-launched cruise missile with a dialable nuclear yield, and deploy that once we have it online. These are options that we have before us so that we can use those to try to squeeze the Russians. Again, it's a nice idea just to use conventional weapons, but if the Russians are not persuaded by that, why would we do it? So we have to push on the buttons that actually are meaningful to the Russian Federation.
Okay, well, let's follow through on this issue. I think in particular, many believe that the U.S. decision to deploy Glickums to Europe in 1983 was extremely significant in compelling the Russians to the negotiating table and contributed to the ultimate conclusion of the INF Treaty. Why would that not be the case now?
Couple of quick points. First, that I agree there are many options within the treaty that should be pursued. What this resolution talks about is immediately going towards development of a new nuclear weapon. The Russians have worked hard on asymmetrical responses to what they see as a NATO-American threat. There is no reason that the United States' response to a Russian threat must be symmetrical. We have conventional means of holding at risk the things that Russia cares about without the introduction of new nuclear weapons. On the issue of, I agree, it worked in the 1980s, but keep in mind a couple of things. One, what worked? Arms control negotiations. It is crazy to say we are going to deploy countervailing weapons until they return to compliance, but we're not going to discuss compliance with them because that would be we're not going to get to a new agreement. Ronald Reagan believed in arms control negotiations for exactly the purposes that Frank stated, and so do I. Secondly, it was an enormous political cost for all of our allies in Europe in the 1980s. It would be worse this time. And third, Putin is not Gorbachev, and sadly, Mr. Trump is not Ronald Reagan.
Let's talk about the linkages between different arms control agreements and treaties. I think this is another area of concern. Many argue that New START provides many benefits, from limiting a potential arms race, at least at the strategic level, to providing transparency and other sources of communication that contribute to stability. Wouldn't we be losing far more than we gain if we try to hold New START hostage to INF? Shouldn't they be treated in their own right and separately?
I don't know why we would have any belief that the Russians would comply with New START treaty if they're not in compliance with the arms control treaties that we have before us now. And that's so. Again, I would go back to my opening remarks and say that I believe that New START, as it is now, there's already evidence that the Russians may not be in compliance by the end of the deadline. But let's say that the Russians, we have deemed that the Russians are complying with the New START treaty, although I I have seen flaws with the New START treaty of itself. But my purpose here in my opening statement was to show that it wouldn't make any sense for the United States to assume or to presume that they would be complying with that treaty if this other critically important treaty is not being enforced. So I would put pressure on the INF treaty, and I would look to New START and bring it to the Russian table and say, look, if this is something that you would like to extend, it's in your own interest, then we need to shore up the other treaties that are currently not being followed.
The Russians have violated every arms control treaty we've signed with them, with the exception of New START, and as Rebecca says, there's time for that to happen too. It is living in Never Never Land to believe that they are currently abiding by arms control treaties. They have broken those treaties. If we signal that we're prepared to sign or extend New START, we're saying we don't really care that you've broken all these other treaties. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. We're going to sign another treaty, and you can violate that too, and we will abide by the treaty. That is not a way to conduct diplomacy.
All right, let's tackle that one. So, what good are treaties that are not enforced? How can we have confidence in negotiations that don't result in compliance?
Ooh, I don't even know where to start on this one. So we don't assume anything. We have verifications. We have inspectors on the ground. With New START, we have thousands of notification exchanges. Every year we have 18 on-the-ground inspections, and despite whatever rumor mongering goes on, in various columns or blogs around town, Russia is in compliance with the New START treaty according to our State Department, our intelligence community, our Defense Department, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, period. So in the general idea that Russia cheats on anything, so we shouldn't try at all, yes, they spend a lot of time struggling against the constraints of the international agreements of which they are a part. It's a problem. But the bigger problem in my mind is a Russia completely unconstrained by treaties or agreements, with Putin free to build up arsenals to his heart's content. When it comes to BWC, do we have concerns about their record of their Soviet biological weapons program? Yes. Are they building an offensive biological weapons program right now today? No. So there's got to be differences for that. Fact of that matter, chemical weapons convention is a problem for both the U.S. and Russia. The U.S. has not met its destruction limits, and I think the Russians are actually a bit ahead of us on that. We can fix treaties. We have fixed treaties. It's a matter of being willing to do the hard work and not just basically demand that everything be fixed all at once and throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not willing to take that risk on weapons of mass destruction.
No, simply that we have means to verify New START compliance. And this debate today is about INF, not about New START. But I don't presume that the Russians are in violation. We have complaints against each other, which are addressed in the bilateral commission. And I think it is unwise to preclude the possibility that we would extend the one treaty that is working, that both sides agree is substantially being met, and that provides for our national security.
Okay, I'm going to do one last question to each side, and then we'll turn to rebuttals and then questions from the audience, so you can start to get thinking about what you would do. Team in favor of the resolution. It seems that our allies may have very little enthusiasm right now for a robust, especially a nuclear-related buildup in any way in Europe. How would you, suggest to actually overcome that, to implement what you suggest? And don't you believe there is a significant risk that if NATO cannot be persuaded, which seems like it could be difficult to take such significant steps, do we run the risk of simply spewing empty rhetoric on which we cannot deliver?
No, I think it is. It is necessary that we persuade our NATO allies that not only is deploying additional nuclear-capable weapons to the European theater, that it's in their interest, that it's there to deter war, that it's there for their own safety, it's there for the bolstering and building the security of the NATO alliance. All of this requires great American leadership, which has been absent, or I would say has been not there to the extent that it should be over the last 8-9 years. And so I think if we actually were making these arguments to NATO that this is a good idea, that it's in their interests, and then publicly, rather than just privately in rooms talking about the threat that Russia posed to the NATO alliance, making these public statements, actually calling out Russian violations more forcefully, I do think that we can actually persuade and move the needle so that our NATO allies understand that this is actually in its own interest and will strengthen the NATO alliance. Again, the options that Frank and I have put before us do not violate the INF Treaty. These are options before us on a spectrum of capabilities that, one, they're not just ideas that we think would be neat to convince Russians. These are ideas that the Russians would actually find persuasive to force them to go back into compliance, which is why these are the levers we have to pull.
You made the assumption that we're talking, we said we should do research and development, not deploy. Second, as you pointed out in your remarks, we might well choose not to go land-based in Europe. We might choose to go TLAM-N and F-35Cs on carriers in crisis deployments. So we're not locking into anything, but we're saying, if you believe in arms control, we can talk about deterrence in the closing comments. If you believe in arms control, you've got to bring them back into compliance with the treaty because everything else has to date failed. And again, there are all the other treaties that they've violated.
Okay.
Just a quick word on that, which is if I absolutely agree that we should have been even more forceful during the Obama administration. We had a very crowded Russian agenda that included violations by Russia that Frank has already enumerated. And this is a good moment to press harder. But a harder diplomatic press means convincing our allies. And that also means having a president who is more willing to see Vladimir Putin as a national security threat than he sees the mayor of London.
Okay. Let me ask you all a question then along these lines. So, you've expressed a lot of confidence in the New START Treaty. As we approach the requirement for implementation along the lines of the central limits, would your views substantially change on either account if it turns out that Russia does not meet the targets, which they're off to some extent now? If those targets are not reached, how would that change your calculus of what you've discussed so far?
I would assume that the administration would have an interagency discussion that takes into account both the military and diplomatic implications of that and, decide how to move forward. Is New START still worth pursuing? Should we continue to push to get to those numbers? Is this a technical violation? Did they have slowdowns in their ability to reach the central limits from just a logistical perspective, or did they intentionally not reach the deadline? Reducing nuclear threats is the goal. So if we find that New START is still worth pursuing insofar as it's helping to reduce nuclear threats, then yes, you go forward. If it turns out that we don't make that assessment with a full interagency team of experts, then that's a different subject.
All right, with that, we will turn to the rebuttals, so they can have anything I didn't manage to throw back to one side or the other in my questions. You'll have a chance to pick and choose, but you'll have to do it quickly. So on rebuttals, we will have, let's see, Alex, you are first with 5 minutes, and then we will hand the baton to Rebecca for her 5 minutes.
Thank you. As is, probably to be expected, I think we're reading the resolution somewhat differently. When we read it, additional meant to us new, because we have existing capabilities that are currently deployed to deal with the INF violation. So reading this resolution to me means a push for new options, and particularly if you look at how the debate has been going in the Senate and the House, the talk of a either dual capable or conventional ground-launched cruise missile either of which, the testing of either of which would violate the INF Treaty is sort of where the debate is going. So, unless both Rebecca and Frank are willing to say publicly that they think deploying a nuke LICM is a bad idea, which I would love, then I think that's really where the debate is. And this idea that we keep hearing that you can just do the same thing over and it will work, I think that wildly underestimates the role that the particular people, the circumstances, and almost sheer luck played a role in how we got to INF the first time. The Europeans don't feel pressured or threatened by this particular violation in the same way. The public in Europe is sure to resist. I don't agree with Rebecca that we can simply convince the Europeans, having dealt a lot with the Europeans on various nuclear weapons issues in the previous administration. They definitely have their own views. They actually have lots of debates occurring in addition to the most recent German election where nuclear weapons was actually a topic. Many of our allies, both governments and their citizens, don't necessarily trust President Trump, and unfortunately he's giving them good reason not to. So we don't have a lot of legs to stand on. But most of all, I think, we have multiple nuclear crises on our hands right now. We have one active in North Korea. We have one potentially erupting in Iran if we abandon the JCPOA, another place where the U.S. would sort of lose credibility as far as its adherence to international agreements and being a leader on nonproliferation. But adding a third one of expanding nuclear capabilities in Europe and provoking the Russians into a worse situation is dangerous. It's assuming President Trump can play chess, I have serious doubts about his abilities to play Candyland at this point. So I don't think this is a good move for the United States to be making.
We have to start from the principle that we are trying to actually persuade Russia to go back into compliance with the INF Treaty. So if we think conventional weapons can do it, if we think holding a spring dance can do it, it doesn't matter. What matters is what do the Russians actually believe would force them to go back into compliance with the INF Treaty. That's why when you look at these options before, and again, we're going to study the ground-launched cruise missile to see if that's something that makes sense, or we can actually just look at it again without actually doing anything to deploy or test a program like this that would be in violation of the treaty. And we're looking at deploying other nuclear options that would not in and of themselves be in violation of the treaty. It would be nice if we didn't have to deploy nuclear weapons, but that's not what this is about. This is about actually deterring conflict. This is about looking what the Russians are doing. This is about looking at how the Russians understand this escalate to de-escalate is highly destabilizing. And I wish that my colleagues would I find it interesting that my colleagues think that it is more plausible to convince the Russians than it is to convince our European allies. I actually think that our European allies have more in common with us than the Russians, and so I think that it behooves us to actually use our diplomatic heft to work with our allies to understand that the NATO alliance is critical, we have to defend it, and these are the options in order to preserve peace and deter conflict. And last, my colleagues have spent more time running off our own president than that of the Russian Federation.
Okay, with that, we're going to open for audience questions. I'll be circulating the mics. I am going to make one request. Will, could we please ask someone next door to check in? They need to exit the room because it's become disruptive.
Will they be louder out there?
No, it's actually louder right here.
Okay.
So let me see. I'm going to see. Do we have two people on mic? Yes. So we'll have one here on this side and one over here. This one is first. We have a woman in the back.
Hey,
Please state your name, your affiliation, and only a question briefly stated. Thank you.
So Catherine Kauser, LPJ School of Public Affairs. And my question is, do you think the recent Russian violations of the treaty have moved us any closer to midnight on the world clock? And do you think your proposed solutions move us closer or farther from midnight?
Has moved us closer to reliance on...
Midnight on the doomsday clock?
Oh, the doomsday clock.
Okay.
It's got nothing to do with the doomsday clock. Look, the only thing, if you want to talk about the doomsday clock, the fact that the Russian Federation rejected President Obama's call to reduce its reliance on nuclear weapons has fielded a panoply of new INF systems short-range systems and is in the middle of a massive upgrade of its triad. Before we have put any new systems in the field, yeah, I'll move the doomsday clock for you on that. But as far as anything that we have been talking about here, we haven't done anything. The Russians are acting in a dangerous and destabilizing manner, and that's what we're talking about.
I largely agree with what has just been said. The even more concerning to me than this deployment, which is plenty concerning, is the fact that the Russians have not only reintroduced the concept of tactical use of nuclear weapons, the insanity of so-called escalate to de-escalate, but that President Putin has returned to something that U.S. and Russian presidents gave up decades ago, which is talking about nuclear power being the measure of the country's greatness. I mean, there are only two things that make Russia a superpower today, and that's nuclear weapons and creative computer programming. But it has brought us closer on the doomsday clock when the Russians talk about a new nuclear doctrine. What is interesting to me that we haven't discussed yet, I was concerned in my previous position in the State Department about a violation of a treaty. That is huge. That is significant. But what we haven't discussed is how much is this deployment an actual military threat? I don't mean would they use it. I mean, what new capability does it give them to which we must respond? And my view is that we should not overreact to something that gives Russia only a marginal increase in capacity that we can meet elsewhere, and we should not overreact by abandoning decades worth of valued arms control arrangements.
I had one over here. Thank you. Stand. Yeah.
Greg Tillman, board member of the Arms Control Association. 30 years ago, the Soviet Union was in clear and unambiguous violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, blatant violation. The U.S. had detected it 5 years earlier. From everything that Frank and Rebecca said, I would have to assume that your advice to President Reagan would have been, do not sign this treaty. And I wanted you to explain to me how your logic is any different other than this treaty was a terrible precedent-setting mistake by Ronald Reagan.
Look, Greg, you were there. The ABM treaty, the ABM treaty was at that point sui generis. We're talking about 7 or 8 arms control treaties that the Russians are violating today, blatantly violating today. What we are talking about is trying to bring them back into compliance with those treaties. We are the arms control advocates at this table. So, I mean, don't confuse us with the ABM treaty and what had to be done in Europe. There were circumstances then where we needed to stop the SS-20 deployments, and the only way to have done that was the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missile. There are lots of people in this room who are part of that. Nobody believes that the Russians would have come back to the table after they walked out in 1983 if they had been also able to stop the deployments through their compromise and their political maneuvers in Europe. If the Pershing and the Glickam had not shown up, there would be no INF treaty. So what we are doing is taking a page from the Reagan book and saying, give them unacceptable alternatives and let them get back into the treaty.
And that's where it ties in with the last statement made over here by my colleagues, who said that if we do find out that when the deadline comes for New START that they are in violation, regardless of the reason, that if we sort of look and see that it still is in our interest to keep the treaty, that's not how arms control agreements work. Again, to quote President Obama, rules must be binding, violations must be punished, words must mean something. If we are actually going to use any sort of arms control at all to get a handle on this stuff, then we actually have to look at what the words of the treaty say and force that compliance hard. This isn't something like we have a treaty and then we just sort of look at it and figure out if it's close enough for us. That's not how we comply with the treaties, and so it's not in our self-interest to allow that kind of violations by our adversaries.
Okay, let me capture it in the next question. Because I'd like to see if someone has a question for Team Countryman Bell. Very good, we'll take it up here.
Picking up, I'm Hank Gaffney. I was in at the beginning of the whole Euro missiles business. But thinking of what Tom said, what do we know really about this SSC-8? For right now, the Russians have gone wild with Caliber missiles and putting them on everything. Every one of them could be nuclear, presumably. In my own research on the Iskander missile, I found no reference to a nuclear capability. So I'm not even sure the SSC-8 has one. And I would like a comment on what I saw I think it was Joe Cirincione said the other day. Okay, the question is, do we really know this caliber missile as the SSC-8 and what its length is?
Well, the Russians know. Some folks in the intelligence community know, but this is not an intelligence briefing. I think the point I would make is even if you assume the SSC-X8 is conventional only, it is destabilizing and it is a violation. If you assume it is nuclear, it is a violation, it is even more destabilizing, and paradoxically but true, if it is dual capable, it is a violation and it is very destabilizing of the strategic situation in Europe. Now, that's not the same as saying it gives them a broad new set of options. It may or it may not. We haven't really discussed that today. But it is a violation, and that is, as Frank and Rebecca have said, what should concern us. Just one point on Frank's last comment. I agree with him. We should present to Moscow unacceptable alternatives. What I disagree with is the statement here in the resolution that unacceptable alternative is necessarily and exclusively a new nuclear capability. I think we have other options.
Yeah. Augustus Alzona. I'm a private citizen who happened to be an advisor to the Trump for President campaign. My question is for whomever cares to answer this question, but basically, if you were president now, how would you convey, maybe one paragraph or less, or maybe even in a tweet, what you think convey to the American people to take your position on this, and at the same time keeping in mind that you've got I know this town, given all the fake news and leaks, sort of keeping that in the back of your mind. How would you sort of overcome that after you put your tweet out? Whoever cares to answer it. Thank you.
I wouldn't deal with this problem by tweeting, first of all. Second of all, I think that what we should do is begin working with our NATO allies. I think that we begin getting serious in using American leadership with our NATO allies. We come up with a plan and a strategy while having clear eyes, not rose-colored glasses, about the threat from the Russian Federation. And then we develop some options that NATO is happy with and understands that would preserve the security of the alliance and deter Russia. And so I think that the president can do that. I think he can do it privately starting out. I think that that he's got a great national security team that can help to make that happen as well. But we got to get started because we lost a lot of ground over the last 9 years. 8, 9 years.
Yeah, we do have diplomatic options. We need to get more information out about the nature of this violation to the allies and public in a way that does not put the sources and methods at risk. The goal, I think, is getting back to Special Verification Commission meetings to talk about these issues at a technical level, both the Russian violation and the Russian concerns about U.S. systems. You're driving towards mutually acceptable solutions, and no one has rose-colored glasses on this. Russia is the only country in the world that presents an existential threat to the United States. That's exactly why we don't want to do anything that actually increases the likelihood that we can get into a nuclear conflict with the only country that can destroy us.
If I were president, you should all be glad I'm not. I would not rely only on the Secretary of Defense to convey to European allies how much we care about their security. As president, I would talk about European security being more important to me than the tender ego of Vladimir Putin. Secondly, I would state very clearly that Russia cheats. Hell yes, they cheat. The U.S. doesn't. The U.S. has a higher standard. In part, we can have a higher standard because we have a stronger military whose nuclear deterrence capability is unquestioned. And for that reason, I would not, as president, sink to the level of adolescent threats a la Ahmadinejad or Mr. Kim. That guy.
Okay, I know I saw a hand back here. Yes, this woman right here.
My name is Brenna Larkin. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. My question is the threat of being beaten in an arms race, whether it is conventional or nuclear, as big of a deterrent now as it was during the Cold War? And is it enough to force Russia into compliance, or has Mr. Putin become too concerned with preserving, as you said, one of the two reasons it is a superpower?
We're not talking about getting beaten in an arms race. What we're talking about is whether arms control treaties are to be respected or not. If you don't care about the INF treaty or the other treaties we've been talking about, we don't need to participate in them. The Russians can continue their violations, and we can do whatever we decide we have to do without the constraints of a phony treaty that doesn't exist because the Russians are violating it. So no one's saying that there has to be a tit-for-tat set of deployments. What we've been talking about is how do we take the Russian Federation's continued violations of treaty, in this case the INF treaty, and cause them to decide to come back into compliance. It's a very simple question. How do we get them to comply with the international obligations that they have solemnly undertaken to follow?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question, an excellent question, and it goes to the success of President Reagan in the 1980s, that the Soviet Union was concerned about an unlimited arms race. I have no doubt that if through choice or through failure to make choices, the U.S. and Russia fall into a new nuclear arms race, I have no doubt that the U.S. could keep ahead of that, and that at some point it would cause Russia to make the same choice that Mr. Gorbachev made. But it would be incredibly expensive and destabilizing in the meantime. And the United States should seek, while having wide open eyes about the range of Russian violations, we should make choices that contribute to stability.
Yeah, I'll just add a comment or a quote from President Reagan back in 1987, which was, I think as long as you've got a chance to strive for peace, you strive for peace. I don't accept defeatism that somehow we're incapable of solving these problems with Russia and incapable of getting them back to a place where we can have conversations, whether it's about our immediate problems or the development of new technology and systems. The American diplomatic and strategic planners in the country are creative, smart, and determined people, and I put my faith in them before I put my faith in the idea that we can just gamble our way into fixing this.
Thank you, Paulina Senegal, CNS. The first question is, why do you think Russia rejects violation of the treaty? So there are some considerations and reasons. Why do you think Russia rejects that it has violated the INF treaty? And first, and the second, are there direct evidence that SSC 8 violates the INF treaty? Thank you.
Just why does got it? No, just so why does Russia believe they're not in violation? In other words, can we express some perception about what they think from the other side, and do we have any particulars on that particular system? I think kind of sums it up. Do you guys want to respond? Yeah.
It's not in their interest to come right out and say they're violating the INF treaty, so they're lying. The Russians are they are trying to get away with violating the treaty, and as long as the United States does not respond and force them to comply, they are getting away with violating the treaty. So they can continue to say that they're not. But again, there is objective reality, and we know it's been the Obama administration said that they were in violation. We have more evidence that they continue to violate the treaty. So this is a known thing. It's not really up for a question. It's not really disputed that the Russians are in fact in violation of the treaty.
I largely agree. They don't want to say so because they don't want to admit it, and that's it. It is, of course, a cost if you come right out and say that you are choosing to walk away from an agreement despite the fact that you have no reason to do so in the clear text of the agreement. And if the U.S. does the same thing with the JCPOA, it's incredible to think, but we will be at a position of moral equivalence with Vladimir Putin when it comes to respect for the integrity of agreements.
I'll just reiterate that it is still the assessment of our military that this development and deployment does not yet present a threat of military significance.
Thank you. Tom Kalina, Ploughshares Fund. I want to thank you all for being here. And Rebecca, thank you very much for you and your program's partnership throughout this entire debate series. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for doing it. My question, I wanted to get back to me, what is the core question of this debate, which is how should the United States respond to Russia's violation of the INF Treaty? And it seems to me that Russia would like nothing better, as Tom said before, for the United States to violate the INF Treaty and then have that be the excuse for Russia to get out of it. So the key question is, we have the Congress moving towards approving a new program of record to fund a missile system that would violate the INF Treaty, which to me would be falling exactly into Russia's trap by having the United States do something and then get the blame for the treaty falling apart. Should Congress move ahead and authorize that new program or not? Yes or no question?
Tom, I guess you missed what we said. You must have come in late. The development and R&D of the systems that the Congress has called for are treaty compliant. Yes, they are. I mean, they are treaty compliant. I don't know what the next step is. If the treaty compliant work is sufficient to get the Russians to get back into the treaty, that's fine. If it... look.
Let them speak.
Can we please face facts? The INF Treaty is broken. The Russians are not in the INF Treaty. They are violating it. At some point, we are going to have to admit that reality. It's not an old fact, it's a fact. They are violating the treaty. The treaty is broken. In many ways, the treaty doesn't exist anymore, except for us. And at some point in the future, we're going to have to decide what we do about that fact. And if we decide, and I don't know that we will, if we decide to do a counter-deployment of some type, whether it's at sea or in Europe, we need to make crystal clear to the world that the Russians destroyed the treaty and we are responding after it was destroyed. This notion that because they've broken the treaty and we're going to react at some point to preserve our own options that then becomes our fault is ludicrous in the extreme.
May I just? I would just add to this is just research and development, what the Congress is calling for. And if the Russians, it is the Russians. I wish that we could have the same amount of energy directed towards the United States, directed towards Russia. Russia is the one that is violating the treaty. The United States is not violating the treaty. If we study and do research and development on the kinds of weapons that are prohibited by the treaty, and then Russia decides to completely outright breach and walk away from the treaty, then the United States will be in a good position and be prepared to have that capability at hand. This is about what is in the United States, what is best for the United States, and to hold the Russians to the standard at which we hold ourselves.
I'm going to turn it over. I just want to clarify one thing and then ask you to, because I want to make sure, it's very important to me that we accurately represent the facts the best to our ability. So I'd like the panel to confirm my understanding that whether or not you think it is a good idea is a different question. But the language of what is proposed in the NDAA itself to do research and development would not violate the treaty.
That's correct.
So now, if the program were to go beyond research and development in the future, and we were still parties to the treaty, it would be non-compliant. Is that factually correct?
If it was the ground launch system, if it was a sea-based system.
Actually, let's use your microphone.
If
I think
it
this is
was
important.
the ground launch system, if it's a TLAM-N or an F-35C with a carrier-based capability, it would not. If it's an air launch capability based in the CONUS, it would not.
Okay, and so what I'd like to do, the underlying question, yes, definitely, please. Focus on the, is it a good idea part?
I'll just say I don't really know a lot of R&D programs that head across the river and don't become larger programs, but would like to point out that the administration has objected to the language in both the House and the Senate versions, and albeit they say, we may want to pursue options in this in direction, but they want it to be their choice. They want their military planners, their process to consider the array of options and not be forced into a subject, into a particular solution that would, if tested, violate the treaty.
Come pretty close. I know, I'm sorry, you were teed up there as the last question, but I am trying to keep us on a schedule with someone flinking numbers, right in front of me of how much time is left. So what I would like to do is turn now to the closing statements. Frank Miller will speak for 5 minutes in support of the resolution, and Tom Countryman will then speak for 5 minutes in opposition to the resolution, and then we will shake hands, applaud, and head out to the reception.
And drink wine.
Yes, exactly. So there we go.
So I'm going to violate the treaty, and I'm not going to talk. We've already talked about the resolution enough. I'm going to talk about 5 things that were said during the course of this discussion that need to be addressed. One, New START doesn't have to be extended for 3 more years. It's embarrassing now to be falling all over ourselves, given a whole string of Russian arms treaty violations, to wring our hands as to whether or not we're going to extend New START. As Rebecca said, there's plenty of time to see where the Russians go with New START. Second, we do not have new capabilities deployed to deal with INF violations. We have new capabilities deployed in the form of 4 armored brigades to deal with Russian military expansion. Those are not a response to the INF. That's confusing deterrence and arms control. This debate has been about what do we need to do to get the Russians to go back into a nuclear arms control treaty. Conventional forces play a role in deterrence. They don't play a role in getting the Russians back into their treaty. The third thing is it's just a canard. It's just a red herring to say if we actually went out and built these systems that the NDAA is talking about, that we're undercutting our NPT position. The Russians are turning out new ICBMs, SLBMs, SSBNs, bombers, and cruise missiles. The Chinese are turning out new SSBNs, new ICBMs, and new SLBMs, and new bombers. We haven't turned out any new systems, and there won't be a new U.S. system in the field until the 2025, 2027, 28 period. The notion that if we start to respond to these arms races that are going on between the Chinese and the Russians, that we are undercutting the NPT is totally ridiculous. Fourth point, what new capability does the Russians get out of this missile? I don't know. But the Russian General Staff believes so strongly, and Putin believes so strongly, that they made a decision to violate one of the fundamental two treaties of the Cold War era. And they don't do things like that lightly. This is terribly important. They violated an existing treaty to deploy a military capability, and they therefore think it's very important. I don't know what it is, but if it is in fact not brought back into treaty compliance, we will need to find a way to deter their idea to use it. And the last, I beg you, let us not be in deliberate and blind disregard of the facts. We are not abandoning decades of treaties. The Russians have walked out of a series of treaties. They are in non-compliance. If we want to say we are going to unilaterally bind ourselves, that's a political decision. But let's not pretend that the Vienna document or the Budapest Memorandum or any of the other treaties I elaborated or the INF Treaty are in force today. They are not. They are in force for us, not for the Russians. And that is not arms control, that's unilateral restraint. And our diplomats, I think, understand the difference between unilateral restraint and arms control, in which both parties are held to the same standard.
Okay. First, thank you all for sticking through this. I think there are plenty of points of agreement. One, Russia violates agreements whenever it can get away with it. I would like to believe that the U.S. does not have the same reckless disregard for binding commitments. And Frank and Rebecca have not suggested that we should have that disregard. We agree there has to be a response, and it has to be a response that both counteracts the military advantage that Russia has gained with this deployment and gives them a reason to return to compliance. Where we differ, again, from the terms of this resolution is that I do not assume that only a new nuclear capability is capable of delivering to the Russians that unacceptable alternative that I agree would be valuable. And it is important, as Frank just mentioned, that this is happening in the context of a dozen other challenges that Russia is facing, many of which violate international agreements, and others of which are just plain old-style Russian imperialism, and to which it is necessary that NATO respond in a unified fashion, and that's what's happening in the European Readiness Initiative, which we should be prepared to modify and enhance in case to respond to this latest deployment. I think on all of this there's pretty broad agreement, but here's a couple of my concerns. I also strongly agree with Rebecca that the pressure must be directed at Moscow, not in Washington. But we are here to debate what is the correct U.S. response. I am disappointed that Europeans who are the actual targets of this new weapon, not the U.S., Europe, have not done more to press the Russians on this publicly and privately. And it is absolutely essential that we do more. And yes, the U.S. has to lead that diplomatic effort to get our allies to care about their security and the future of arms control as much as all of us up here care about European security and the future of arms control. As I said, Donald Trump is not the person to lead that discussion, unfortunately. But I do believe in the extraordinary capabilities of both some cabinet members and of professionals at the Defense Department and the State Department to help our European allies recognize how important this is and to exert the kind of diplomatic pressure that may bring Russia into compliance. The United States has been a leader. There's a reason we have dozens of allies, and Russia has just Belarus. It's not that they got the last pick in the NFL draft, so they got Belarus. It's because we are firm in our commitments. We take the high road. You're absolutely right, Frank, that Russian and Chinese modernization programs are eroding the confidence of the world community in the effectiveness of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But it's only blown to pieces when the United States says, we're giving up on arms control. I know that's not the phrase that you're saying, but the fact is the United States has an extra responsibility, a level of transparency, a level of verity to our commitments that we must seek to maintain. Finally, I suggest all of us work hard on the appropriate means to influence the Russian Federation, a threat that we won't talk to you anymore about arms control is the least effective possible threat. So with that, I want to thank our colleagues who presented an opposing point of view because I think there's rather more agreement on the analysis, even if we still have some significant differences on the prescription for U.S. policy. So thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank both sides very much. You have once again reinforced the notion that we can have thoughtful debate, express widely differing views, discover the fact that, in fact, common ground exists where sometimes we think it may not. And I think that was very much proven again in this discussion, professional, thoughtful, respectful, and highly substantive. So with those accolades in mind, I would like to ask the audience to join me in thanking the folks up at the podium.